August 1945. Japan's empire had fallen quiet at last. Yet the silence felt heavier than the roar of bombs that had filled the previous years. The sound of surrender was not celebration. It was the hum of a million unanswered questions. Across the islands, soldiers who had been trained never to yield found themselves staring at white flags rising in the distance. The radio broadcast of Emperor Hirohito's voice, the first time his subjects had ever heard it, was crackled and faint, but its words cut through centuries of martial certainty. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Those phrases, chosen carefully to avoid the word defeat, still fell like stones. In the ruins of Tokyo, families emerged from underground shelters to smoke-blackened daylight. Children searched for rice husks in broken warehouses. Mothers bowed toward the imperial palace in tears. Fathers stood motionless, unable to explain how everything they had believed in had vanished in a single announcement. For Japanese soldiers scattered across the Pacific, the order to lay down arms was more disorienting than any explosion. Some refused to believe it. Others broke their swords in ritual acknowledgement of shame. Thousands, bewildered and starving, walked out of jungle hideouts and coastal caves with their hands raised, meeting American patrols whose faces they had been taught to hate. At the same time, in camps hastily assembled by Allied forces, long lines of prisoners shuffled under guard. These were men who had once fought ferociously on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, emblems of the empire's unyielding spirit. Now they were gaunt, sunburned, their uniforms reduced to rags. Many expected execution. Propaganda had convinced them that capture by Americans meant humiliation and torture. They whispered to one another that the enemy would cut out their tongues or use them for bayonet practice. When none of that happened, confusion began to seep in. American soldiers, many barely older than the prisoners, were equally uncertain. They had been conditioned to see the Japanese as fanatics who would rather die than surrender. The sight of these broken men filing into barbed wire enclosures challenged every image they had carried through the war. "They look like kids," one corporal murmured in a letter home. "I don't know what I expected, but not this." The first night in the camp was eerily quiet. The Japanese prisoners sat in rows on the dusty ground, their eyes avoiding the searchlights that swept above them. The Americans, uneasy, smoked cigarettes and kept their rifles ready, half expecting an uprising, but none came. Only the sounds of insects and the distant rumble of trucks moving wounded soldiers filled the air. The smell of diesel, sweat, and sea salt mingled with the sharp scent of fear. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, a mess sergeant was issuing orders for the morning. Breakfast would be served at dawn: oatmeal, eggs, bread, and coffee. Ordinary food for American troops, but to the prisoners it would be the first real meal prepared by the hands of their former enemies. No one knew yet that this small act would ripple through memory and history as a moment of extraordinary humanity. As the hours dragged on, a light rain began to fall. The Japanese men, many barefoot, turned their faces upward, letting the drops wash away the grime of battle. Some muttered prayers, others simply stared into the darkness. Among them was Sergeant Takeshi Sato, a 27-year-old from Nagano who had last eaten 2 days earlier a handful of millet shared with 3 comrades before their capture on Okinawa. He sat clutching a small cloth pouch that once carried rice balls from home, now empty except for a pebble he kept as a reminder of his village. Across the camp, Private First Class Tom Henderson from Kansas leaned against a jeep, writing in his notebook by flashlight. "Rain again," he wrote. "The Japs are quiet. Not a sound from them. Maybe they're thinking the same thing we are. How did it all come to this?" He didn't know that the prisoners, though silent, were indeed thinking of families, of honor, of the thin line between survival and disgrace. The night closed in around both sides, equal in exhaustion, unequal in power, and bound together by an uneasy truce that neither had imagined possible. The first rays of morning stretched across the camp like a reluctant promise. The air was heavy with damp earth and the faint scent of smoke from kitchen fires that had been lit just before dawn. American soldiers moved briskly around the camp, some still yawning, others adjusting their helmets and cleaning their rifles. There was a strange mix of routine and uncertainty, the kind of rhythm that exists when people are trying to restore order after chaos but don't quite remember what normal feels like. Beyond the fences, Japanese prisoners began to stir from their restless sleep. Some had dreamed of home, of mothers bowing before family shrines, of rice fields shimmering in summer light. But when they opened their eyes, the barbed wire reminded them of their new reality. The camp was quiet, except for the shuffle of bare feet on dirt and the occasional clang of a tin cup. A few men whispered, their voices low and uncertain. The rumors from the previous night lingered that the Americans would execute officers, that the food might be poisoned, that surrender had stripped them of any right to live as men. Near the command tent, Lieutenant Robert Miller read through his morning orders. He was 24, barely out of college when he enlisted, and had already seen more death than he could bear. He had been at Okinawa, where the bodies of young men, American and Japanese alike, lay tangled in red mud. Now, overseeing the daily operations of the POW camp, he carried the weariness of someone much older. His job that morning was simple in theory: to ensure the prisoners received their first official meal since capture. Yet, he knew that nothing about this act was simple. Feeding an enemy was one thing. Restoring their humanity was another. One, 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 one. In the camp kitchen, American cooks were busy at large steel pots. The smell of scrambled eggs, coffee, and freshly baked bread drifted into the air, the kind of aroma that had always meant comfort to soldiers who longed for home. But this time, the meal was not for them alone. Sergeant Mike Donnelly, a broad-shouldered man from Chicago who had survived the Philippines campaign, leaned on the counter and muttered, "Never thought I'd be cooking breakfast for Japs." The corporal beside him shrugged. "War's over," he said simply. "They're just men now." That single sentence carried more truth than either of them realized. At precisely 7 o'clock, the gates opened. American guards called for the prisoners to line up. The Japanese moved slowly, disciplined even in defeat, forming neat rows as if drilled for inspection. Some still limped from untreated wounds. Others held on to comrades for balance. No one spoke. Their faces were thin, their eyes hollow. But somewhere beneath the fatigue was curiosity, a flicker of wondering what awaited them next. From behind a wooden table, a line of American soldiers began distributing metal trays. Each tray carried a modest portion: a scoop of eggs, a slice of bread, a cup of hot coffee, and a small apple. To the Americans, it looked like rations. To the prisoners, it looked like mercy. Sergeant Takeshi Sato, who had not eaten since his capture, stepped forward when his turn came. His hands trembled as he reached for the tray, unsure if it was permitted to look directly at the soldier offering it. The American, a young private with freckles and tired eyes, nodded toward the food, wordlessly signaling that it was his. Sato bowed slightly before taking it, his eyes glancing at the steaming eggs as if they might vanish. For a few moments, no one ate. The prisoners sat in silence, staring at the meal before them. The aroma was unfamiliar rich, almost overwhelming after months of starvation and rough foraged grains. Someone whispered a short prayer under his breath. Then, one man took a bite. The sound of a spoon scraping against tin broke the stillness, and slowly, others followed. At first, there was hesitation, cautious bites, quiet chewing. But as the warmth of the food filled their mouths, something shifted. The fear began to loosen. Shoulders straightened, eyes lifted. Some wept silently, not from hunger alone, but from the bewildering realization that their captors, the same men they had fought against with blind fury, had offered them kindness. On the American side, a few soldiers watched the scene unfold. Lieutenant Miller stood with his arms folded, studying the faces of the prisoners. He had expected anger, maybe even defiance, but what he saw instead was something fragile: gratitude, mixed with confusion. For the first time, he wondered what this moment might mean, not just for the men in front of him, but for the world beyond the fence. War had dehumanized everyone it touched. The propaganda posters, the hate-filled broadcasts, the years of bloodshed, all of it had turned human beings into monsters in one another's eyes. And yet, here, in a dusty camp under a rising sun, one simple meal was undoing some of that damage. When the breakfast ended, the prisoners returned their trays quietly. One older man, perhaps a former officer, bowed deeply before stepping back into line. The gesture needed no translation. Miller felt a lump in his throat. That night, in his journal, he wrote, "Today we fed the enemy." But for the first time, it didn't feel like us and them. It just felt like men being men again. The prisoners would later speak of this day as the moment their fear began to fade. The Americans would remember it as the morning when victory finally felt real, not because of dominance, but because of decency. Outside the camp, the world was still fractured, cities in ruins, nations in mourning. But within those fences, something extraordinary had begun. A silent reconciliation, born not of treaties or speeches, but of bread and kindness. The morning's breakfast did not end when the trays were stacked and counted. It lingered in the air, like a new language everyone was just beginning to learn. In the yard, the prisoners settled back into their designated areas, knees folded under them, hands resting on their thighs. Their posture was correct, almost ceremonial, but their faces had softened. Where there had been an armored blankness, there was now the subtle animation of thought, the scarcely visible play of surprise, suspicion, relief, and the first small beams of curiosity. The guards noticed it too. The men in khaki loosened their grips on their rifles without quite meaning to, speaking to one another in tones that no longer had to be loud. Routine continued: latrines to be dug, water to be hauled, inventory to be logged, but something in the geometry of the place had changed. The fence was still there, but its meaning felt less absolute. Sergeant Takeshi Sato cradled his tin cup long after the coffee had cooled. He had never tasted coffee before the war. To him, bitterness had always been a flavor of medicine, not a drink to be savored in the morning. Yet the lingering taste on his tongue was strangely comforting, like a proof that time could be divided into before and after. He remembered the field rations of his unit's salted fish when they were lucky, millet and sweet potato, the occasional rice ball wrapped in seaweed, and he remembered the slow, humiliating arithmetic of starvation on Okinawa. One handful of grain divided among 4, then 6, then 10 men, each pretending to be satisfied so the others would eat. He thought of the pebble in his pouch, the one he had kept from the bank of the narrow river near his village. The pebble was smooth, cool, constant. This morning's coffee was the opposite: hot, bracing, alive. For an instant, he imagined placing the cup on the tatami mat of his parents' home, steam curling into the rafters, his mother marveling at the foreignness of the smell. He felt a tug in his chest and pressed the cup against his palm until the metal bit his skin. On the other side of the yard, a young private named Nakamura watched the Americans with a bewilderment that bordered on fascination. During training, he had been taught to kill with a bayonet in 3 motions and to die rather than be taken. He still felt shame, the kind that sat in the stomach like a stone, yet the guard nearest him had just offered a half smile as he passed. A gesture so ordinary that Nakamura found himself wanting to return it. He didn't. Instead, he measured the guard's posture, the way the man stood, with one hip slightly forward. The easy way he kept his weapon slung. The guard was nothing like the demon caricatures in the pamphlets they had been shown. He was sunburned, a little tired, with dust in the creases of his boots. He looked, Nakamura realized, like a laborer about to finish a long shift, and this realization, more than the food, undid something in him. Lieutenant Robert Miller used the quieter hour after breakfast to walk the perimeter with the camp medic, a lanky southerner everyone called Doc Harlan. They spoke in clipped sentences about practical things: dysentery, malaria, the need for quinine, the shortage of bandages. But inevitably their conversation shading into the moral terrain they had been circling for months. You see that old guy in the second row? Harlan asked, pointing with his chin. Legs swollen like a melon, needs drainage, won't come to the tent. Miller followed the direction of the nod and saw a narrow face, eyes down, jaw set. He'll come, Miller said. He just needs to believe we're not going to take his leg off for sport, Harlan snorted softly. Hell of a world where breakfast counts for more than a Red Cross armband, Miller didn't disagree. The work of reassembling truths would be piecemeal, improvised, filled with awkward, untranslatable moments. He had the uneasy sense that the war had shattered not just bodies and buildings, but the basic agreements by which people recognized one another as human. If that was true, then this morning's meal had been more than calories. It had been an argument, quietly made, that some agreements could be rebuilt. In the kitchen, Sergeant Mike Donnelly leaned back on a crate and rubbed his neck. He had cooked for men who charged pillboxes and men who never returned from patrol. He had cooked in rain that turned the ground to sucking mud and in heat that made the air shimmer. Cooking for prisoners ought to have felt like an insult to the memory of friends lost. It didn't. He found himself thinking of his mother's stove, the way she squeezed every last virtue out of a humble pantry during the Depression, the way a good meal could make a cold room warmer. You think they liked it? The freckled private asked, stacking trays. Donnelly shrugged. They ate it, didn't they? He paused. We can do hot cereal tomorrow, easier on the stomachs. Maybe some canned fruit if supply will cough it up. The private nodded, surprised by his own relief. Between them, unremarked, an ethic was being born. Do the next thing well because you can, and let that be reason enough. The second day brought small tests. A rumor started that the Americans would force the prisoners to shave their heads as a mark of disgrace. It was a rumor born of imagination and fear, and it spread quickly in whispers that fluttered like birds along the rows. When the guards did nothing of the sort, when instead they delivered fresh water and gestured, with a kind of clumsy respect, toward the wash area, the rumors seemed, for the first time, to lose their power. That afternoon, an officer with a stiff back and a face like carved wood asked, through an interpreter, whether men could write a few lines to inform their families they were alive. Miller said yes. The officer bowed curtly. Later, as the sun slid down and turned the yard amber, men crouched over scraps of paper and wrote slowly, their handwriting disciplined even in captivity. They began with formalities, health reports, expressions of duty, and then, almost in spite of themselves, let their sentences curve into tenderness. Dear Father, I dishonored our name by surviving, but I am alive. Dear Mother, I received food this morning. Please water the plum tree for me. The Americans, for their part, wrestled with ghosts. Private Tom Henderson, who had written the night before about the rain, found himself studying a prisoner's hands and thinking of his brother's hands back home in Kansas, hands that planted seed and fixed engines. At mess, a corporal told a story about Saipan, about a banzai charge and the blur it made of all moral distinctions. The table fell quiet. Finally, someone said, "Yeah, but that was then." It was not a profound statement, and yet it held an invitation to let time do part of the work that neither justice nor vengeance could complete. On the third morning, a minor conflict flared near the gate. A young prisoner, not more than 19, froze when an American guard gestured for him to move forward. The gesture, a quick sweep of the hand, resembled to the boy's eye, a signal he had seen before training assaults. He flinched, then stepped backward, breathing hard. The guard, startled, stepped forward. The air tightened. Sato, 2 men away, saw the misunderstanding unfold and, with a steadiness that surprised him, raised both palms and said softly, in fractured English, "No understand." The guard stopped, blinked, and lowered his hand. "It's okay," he said, pointing slowly now. And then he did something that would be recounted later and grow in the retelling into a parable. He took off his canteen and held it out. The boy stared, then reached, then drank. Around them, the yard exhaled. The moment lodged in Sato's memory like a tack. It would hold later episodes of doubt in place. That afternoon, Doc Harlan set up a triage corner under a canvas fly. He examined the old man with the swollen leg and spoke through the interpreter with exaggerated patience. "We will drain the fluid. You will feel pressure. We will bandage. You will walk better." The old man's eyes flickered to the instruments and then to Harlan's face. It was not trust, not yet, but it was a willingness to let the future be larger than the present pain. When the procedure was done, the old man swallowed once, twice, and inclined his head. Harlan, who had dug shrapnel out of Marines by the light of a Zippo, felt a sudden weariness and an equally sudden gratitude for the ordinary miracle of pus and relief. He motioned for the next patient. Evening settled into a rhythm. The American camp quieted after mail call, voices rising and falling as letters were read and reread. Across the fence, the prisoners murmured sutras or fragments of folk songs, the notes barely audible under the insect chorus. There was a scattering of English phrases, "Good morning," "Thank you," offered tentatively, like coins slid across a counter. Now and then, a guard would try a Japanese word he'd heard from an interpreter and mispronounce it so badly that even the most solemn prisoner had to hide a smile. These small erosions of distance did not erase the past, but they made the present livable. One night, rain came hard, drumming on the canvas roofs and turning the yard to slick clay. Lightning stitched the far horizon. In the dark, a tent stake pulled loose on the prisoner's side, and the canvas began to sag. Before the nearest Japanese could cast about for a solution that would not look like an attempt to tamper with the perimeter, a pair of American guards waded in with extra rope. No one said much. They worked by flashlight, hands muddy, breath white in the cooling air. The rope held. The canvas lifted. As the guards sloshed back to their post, a low murmur followed them, a polite wave of thanks that had no precise translation but needed none. The first week ended with a Sunday that felt different, though schedules barely changed. Men on both sides marked time in their own ways, some by prayer, some by habit, some by a stubborn refusal to let days have names. In the afternoon, Lieutenant Miller stood by the fence and watched a group of prisoners repair a torn sleeve with fine, neat stitches. He thought about the Geneva rules he had been briefed on, the lectures about dignity and lawful treatment, and he thought about the ways those abstract commitments only truly existed when enacted at a human scale. Rules without acts were proclamations. Acts without rules were sentiment. To hold the line between them was the work of adults in a world that had been, for 6 years, governed by children's nightmares. That evening, Sato took the pebble from his pouch and washed it in a tin of water until it gleamed. He thought of his father's hands, the same hands that had taught him to tie fishing line and to bow correctly at the shrine. He could not yet imagine the day he would return home, whether he would be welcomed, whether he would be tolerated, whether he would be despised. But he could imagine walking to the river again, the particular feel of the bank underfoot, the smell of wet grass. The memory did not absolve him of guilt, nor did it erase the faces of the dead. It simply anchored him to a future that was not a void. In the American compound, Henderson wrote another entry by the glow of a shielded lantern. He described the coffee, the rain, the moment with the canteen, the stubbornness of the old man who finally relented to the needle. He drew a little sketch of the yard, a few lines suggesting men seated in rows, the blunt triangle of the fence. He stopped, tapped the pencil against the paper, and then added a final sentence that surprised him as he wrote it. "I think the war is ending in us at different speeds." Days later, a shipment arrived with more staples: flour, canned milk, dried fruit. Donnelly whistled low and said, "Well, I'll be damned," and set the kitchen in motion. Oatmeal became a morning ritual, careful portions to spare stomachs, unaccustomed to plenty. The first time the prisoners tasted the soft sweetness of canned peaches, there was a collective pause as if they had encountered not a food but a message from a world that had not been destroyed. A few closed their eyes. One man laughed once, a short, incredulous burst that startled his neighbors, and then, after a second, spread into a ripple of embarrassed smiles. The peaches were sticky, undignified, joyous. They lodged in memory beside the coffee as proof that life could be, again, deliciously pointless. None of this erased the ruptures. News filtered in of atrocities and counter-atrocities, of tribunals being organized, of facts being pried out of the wreckage with bloody fingers. Both camps read headlines that made the stomach turn. Yet in the bounded space of the yard, the logic of annihilation slowly lost its grip. A guard began learning to count in Japanese. A prisoner asked, haltingly, for the English word for river. The interpreter showed them where the words did not map neatly onto each other, and laughed at the mutual clumsiness. The laughter sounded like a rumor of innocence. When the first letters out of the camp were finally collected for dispatch, Sato folded his page carefully. He had written what he could bear. I am alive. I am treated decently. I am sorry. He sealed the paper with a small crease of the fingers, as he had seen clerks do, and handed it to the corporal with the freckled face. The corporal slid it into a sack and nodded. For a second, their eyes met. Neither man looked away quickly. Neither smiled. They only held one another's gaze long enough to register a truth so simple it felt like a luxury. Here we are. As dusk fell that night, the camp seemed both the same and not. The fence still divided, the guard towers still cast their cautious shadows, discipline still governed the distribution of time and movement. But within those strictures, a different arithmetic now prevailed. The prisoners had not been made free by breakfast, nor had the Americans been redeemed by kindness. Such fairy tales belonged to a world naive about the tenacity of harm. What had happened was smaller, and therefore more durable. Appetite had been met without humiliation. Fear had been answered without ridicule. Suffering had been acknowledged without spectacle. From such modest exchanges, a vocabulary of recognition was taking shape. No one could yet say how far that vocabulary would carry them back to homes remade, forward into alliances unimagined. For now, it was enough that when men rose at dawn and stood in line, they did so with the memory of warmth in their bellies and the possibility, however faint, of warmth in the day ahead. As the days stretched into weeks, the boundaries of time inside the camp grew uncertain. The prisoners rose with the dawn and slept at dusk, but the hours in between seemed to blend together like the fading colors of a long sunset. Outside the wire, the world was trying to rebuild itself, new governments, new borders, new promises, but inside, the rhythm was slower, quieter, built on gestures more than words. Each morning began with the clang of a bell, the sound that once marked military drills now signaling breakfast. The Americans kept to their routines, roll call, rations, sanitation checks, while the Japanese prisoners began to find meaning in repetition. Order, even in captivity, was a comfort. It reminded them that they were still soldiers, still bound by a kind of honor, even if their emperor's voice had faded into static weeks ago. Sergeant Takeshi Sato had begun to recognize faces among the guards. There was the freckled private with the tired smile, the medic with his calm eyes, the sergeant who hummed to himself while stirring the morning oats. They had stopped looking like conquerors. They were simply men with jobs to do, men who sometimes rubbed the sleep from their eyes and laughed at jokes Sato couldn't understand. What astonished him most was how ordinary kindness could appear without announcement. One afternoon, when the heat was thick and the air shimmered over the dirt, Sato saw a small commotion by the kitchen. One of the guards had dropped a crate of apples, and they rolled across the ground like scattered marbles. The instinct in Sato's body was immediate. He moved forward to help, then froze, remembering the rules. But before he could retreat, the guard waved him closer, muttering, "Go on. Lend a hand." They gathered the apples together, brushing off dust, placing them back in the crate. The guard looked at him and said something that Sato did not catch. It wasn't a command. It sounded like gratitude. That night, when Sato closed his eyes, he could still feel the weight of the apple in his palm, the smooth skin, the faint sweetness of dust and fruit. The days that followed the rain carried a strange calm, as though the world had drawn a long breath it did not know how to release. The monsoon clouds cleared, leaving the air sharp and blue. In that stillness, the camp settled into its most human rhythm yet. The clang of the morning bell no longer startled the prisoners. The guards no longer barked orders. There was still discipline, still the dull ache of captivity, but the fear that once ruled every glance had ebbed. What remained was habit cleaning, cooking, mending, and underneath habit, a cautious curiosity about what might come next. Sato found himself noticing details that had been invisible before. The way light fell through the gaps in the fence and made thin golden bars on the ground. The smell of yeast from the kitchen. The distant crash of waves against the breakwater. These small things had nothing to do with war or defeat. They belonged to life itself. When he shared them in quiet conversation, other men nodded, as if they too had rediscovered the world's ordinary music. Lieutenant Miller spent his evenings walking the perimeter alone. He had been reading reports from Tokyo. The trials, the devastation, the staggering numbers, and each figure felt both vast and meaningless. Yet within his own narrow jurisdiction, meaning was everywhere. In the patient way, Doc Harlan redressed a wound. In Donnelly's insistence on measuring each ration carefully. In the fragile dignity with which the prisoners bowed before meals. Miller had come to realize that history would be written elsewhere, in grand halls and tribunals. But history's soul might live here, in the anonymous space between vengeance and mercy. One morning he received an order from headquarters. A photographer was being sent to document conditions in the camp. The man arrived with 2 cameras and the weary self-importance of someone who had seen too much. He moved from tent to tent, taking pictures of men lining up for food, of guards standing watch, of the doctor's table. When he pointed his lens toward the eating area, Miller hesitated. He wondered whether a photograph could ever show what truly mattered, the tremor in a prisoner's hands as he lifted a spoon, the cautious politeness in a guard's nod. Still, he let the shutter click. Weeks later, when that photograph appeared in a New York newspaper, captioned "Breakfast for the Vanquished," readers would see only uniformed figures and metal trays. They would not hear the silence between bites, the thin thread of grace that tied those moments together. Inside the wire, the daily exchanges continued to weave their quiet pattern. Nakamura, the young private who once flinched at a guard's gesture, now spent his afternoons helping unload supply trucks. The guard he had feared, Corporal Lewis, taught him the English words for hammer, rope, and nail. In return, Nakamura taught Lewis the Japanese words for river, mountain, and home. They laughed at each other's pronunciation, the laughter short and awkward but genuine. When Lewis carved a small wooden fish from a scrap of crate and handed it to him, Nakamura bowed and whispered, "Arigato." It was a word the corporal already knew, but hearing it that softly felt new. Even the older prisoners, who had once held themselves apart in shame, began to move differently. They no longer avoided the guard's eyes. During roll call, a few offered small nods of acknowledgement. These gestures were modest, unrecorded, yet in them the logic of total war was being unmade. No proclamation of peace could equal the slow, daily practice of it. At dusk one evening, the camp loudspeaker crackled to life. A message from headquarters announced that repatriation lists were being prepared. The prisoners would soon be sent to processing centers before returning home. The words rippled through the yard like wind through tall grass. Some men stood motionless. Others whispered prayers. For months they had lived suspended between past and future, and now both seemed to rush toward them at once. A few wept quietly. Not out of joy, but from the weight of remembering what awaited them beyond the sea. Cities flattened. Families gone. A country learning to live without its gods. Sato sat apart, staring at the horizon. He felt relief, certainly, but also a strange reluctance. Within the fences, he had relearned something he had not known he had lost: the capacity to see others without armor. He wondered whether that vision would survive outside, where shame and hunger and politics would again draw lines between men. Nearby, Nakamura held the carved wooden fish in his hand and asked softly, "Will we remember them?" Sato did not answer. He only closed his fingers over the pebble in his pocket. the smooth weight that had come to mean survival. The last days of the camp passed like a long farewell. There were inventories to complete, documents to sign, photographs to take. On the final morning, the prisoners were assembled at dawn. Trucks waited beyond the gates. Rain had fallen overnight, and the ground smelled of wet dust. Miller stood by the convoy, clipboard in hand, his face drawn but calm. As each line of men passed, he nodded once in acknowledgement, not of rank or duty, but of existence. When Sato reached him, he stopped, bowed low, and then, hesitating, extended both hands. Between them lay the small pebble from his pouch. Miller looked at it for a moment before closing Sato's hands back over it. "Keep it," he said quietly. "You'll need it where you're going." Sato straightened, eyes glistening, and whispered, "Thank you." Then he climbed into the truck. As the convoy pulled away, the guards raised their hands in a silent gesture that was neither salute nor wave. Something in between. Something new. Dust rose, blurred the outlines of men and vehicles, and the camp's noise faded into the distance. In the sudden quiet, Miller found himself thinking not of victory or loss, but of breakfast, the simplest of acts, the one that had begun all this. He imagined how the prisoners would remember it. The steam of coffee in the morning air, the taste of bread, the way fear had given way, if only for a moment, to wonder. He hoped they would remember that the first kindness after war had been offered without condition. That evening, after the last truck disappeared beyond the hills, the camp stood empty. The kitchens were silent, the tents half rolled, the flag hanging limp in the still air. Miller walked once more along the fence, touching the rough wire with his fingertips. Beyond it, the Pacific shimmered like hammered silver. The war was over. The war was not over. But in this small corner of its aftermath, men had learned something worth carrying forward. Later, when historians would catalog treaties and battles, no one would list the breakfast at the prisoner camp. It would not appear in archives or textbooks. Yet for those who had lived it, that morning meal had been the first thread of a new tapestry, the quiet beginning of reconciliation. It had taught that cruelty could be unlearned, that enemies could eat from the same pot and remain human. The memory would travel with them across oceans, tucked in pockets, whispered in families, folded into prayers. And so the silence after surrender was not emptiness after all. It was the sound of hearts relearning their rhythm, of hands unclenching, of a world starting, haltingly, to forgive itself.